Which is the first of all these commandments? In other words, what is the greatest commandment? Friends, we have heard many times in the Gospels, love God, love your neighbor. And if you were to have to summarize all the laws and commandments in both the Old and New Testament into one sentence, it would be this: to love God and to love your neighbor. The key word you see is love. Now, if we can love, then everything else will follow. Love is the glue that connects it all together. But the problem with love is that it can oftentimes be a confusing concept. In fact, it sounds very easy in word to love your neighbor, to love your brothers, your sisters, everyone. And it's so easy to say that we love somebody, right? Our spouse, our brother, our sister, our parents, etc. It's so easy to do it in words. But to put love into practice, now that is something quite different. It is very difficult to do, precisely because our weaknesses and our sinful nature gets the better of us. And though we would like to love our brothers or sisters, our spouse, etc., sometimes it can be very difficult to do. So then when we speak of love, there is the distinction between agape love and eros love. So what's the difference? Agape love is about the action. That is the act of the love. Eros, on the other hand, is the sensual form of love. It is the feeling sense. So think of it like this. If I were to ask you, do you love your mother or your father or spouse or children, etc.? Chances are you would probably say, well, of course I love them. Of course, right? And so then my next question to you would be this. Okay, prove to me how you love that person. How do you prove love with evidence? Well, you would do so by your actions. Because it is only through actions that tell us whether or not we truly love that person. And the action entails serving, right? Service. And so that's the point Jesus gets to us in the Gospels. He says, love your neighbor. How do you love your neighbor? By serving them. Okay, so in the Gospel reading for the 31st Sunday in Ordinary Time Year B, we see that a scribe, and a scribe is a scholar of the law, he came to Jesus, and this scholar of the law asked Jesus, what is the first of all the commandments? Another way to ask this question is, what is the greatest commandment? So then what is it? Here's precisely what the gospel reading for this Sunday states. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. There is no other commandment greater than these. And so the greatest commandment is the commandment to love. So then when Jesus answered this question of the scribe, how does the scribe respond? Well, here's what he says. Well said, teacher. You are right in saying he is one and there is no other than he. And then he continues, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And as we see too in the Gospels, the Pharisees have asked Jesus this question. Others have asked Jesus this question, maybe in indirect ways as well. But the answer is always the same. The answer is always love. And love has to have an object, right? Love God. Love your neighbor. Okay, so then when we talk about love, we need to talk about one more thing, right? And that is the law. Because when we talk about the law, right, what is the greatest commandment? Well, commandment is basically law. So when we talk about the law, there is divine law and then there's human law. And it's important for us to know the distinction between the two. You see, divine law is what God intended the law to be. And this can be observed through nature. This is why it's often said that natural law is the mirror image of the divine law. Because through nature, we can see into the intention of God, the intent of God. Right? And so a mirror image, just look at the mirror and you see a reflection of yourself. Well, nature is a reflection of God's law. And another way to understand divine law is through revelation. Revelation means God revealing himself to us, God revealing, in other words, the laws to us. A perfect example of God's revelation of the law is the 10 Commandments. Remember, God gave Moses the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. And these 10 Commandments became the basis for all the laws and prophets. So then you have divine law. And then on the other hand, you have human law. Now, many of us are familiar with human law. Human laws concern anything from traffic laws to how to organize anything, right? In a city, for example, the governance of building codes, or at our school, at our work, we all have rules, right? Rules is another way for law. Now, here's the thing. Human laws are laws that are created for the ordering of justice and of society. Now, notice the word justice. I have to emphasize the word justice because the law must be just. If it's not a just law, it cannot be a law. But then, whenever I say that, some people always say, well, who gets to determine what law is just and unjust? Now, it gets increasingly complicated, and it's probably better to leave it to the judges and the attorneys to decide, right? This debate can go on and on and on. But when we speak of the law, and in particular here in the context of the commandment, what is the greatest commandment? We have to go back to the Jewish laws. And in the Jewish laws, there are 613 commandments. And to be even more specific, there are about 365 prohibitions, which means you cannot do this or you cannot do that. And then the rest, the 248, are positive commandments. You see, these laws are divided into also the lighter law and then the more important, right? The heavier law or commandment. And so when it comes to the law, there are always extremes. And we always have to avoid extremes. You see, on the furthest left of the law, you have people who want to completely get rid of the law. Love is the main law, and we don't need any law, we don't need any order, etc. But see, the problem if you do this is that you can't have a functional community, because when there is a disagreement, how do you resolve it? Okay, well, you can resolve it with love, but love doesn't always work. And so that's why we have the law. The law is there to help us. What does it say, right? And so on the first left is getting rid of the law. No, that's a bad thing. But then on the furthest right, you end up with the problem known as legalism. You see, it's a total reliance on the law. What does it say? Well, it doesn't say here in the law. Well, what do you do next, right? How do you interpret it? Legalism can be a problem as well. And so, as you can see, both of these are extremes. The key is to find a middle ground. The law which promotes justice provides for all of justice, but then there is room in the law for mercy. And so, in speaking of all this, here's my point. All laws, whether divine law or human law, must make sense. They must be reasonable and not contrary to moral conscience. And so all of the laws, they have to fit these criteria: justice, moral conscience, reasonability, etc., right? But then what is the greatest of all the laws? If we were to have to summarize all the laws. See, that's the question of the scribe here. So then if we go back into the gospel for this 31st Sunday in Ordinary Time Year B, notice how the scribe is asking Jesus about the first of all the commandments, first of all the laws. And as you can see, Jesus answered not just one, but he presents two. You see, there is one commandment but there are, two parts to it. You see, Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor. So one commandment, but two parts. And so you see, these two always go together. And here's why. You cannot love God if you don't love your neighbor. And if you don't love your neighbor, then you are violating God's law, which means you don't really love God. And so they always must be paired together. They go together. And in fact, if you look at the 10 commandments, the first 3 are about the love of God, and the next 7 are about the love of neighbor. And so, friends, love is the foundation of all the commandments. It is the basis for which all the other commandments flow from. You see, love entails keeping all of God's laws and commandments. See, love of our neighbor is more than just a feeling of being kind to others. It entails action. In other words, you must actively love your neighbor, actively. So then, as we reflect on the gospel reading about loving God and loving our neighbor, an important question for us to consider is this: how can I love God this week? And how can I love my neighbor this week? May God bless you.